we start, can I see a show of hands? How many of you have ever endured a boring or irrelevant presentation at a conference before? Hands up if you've experienced that phenomenon. Okay, lots of you. Okay, second question, be honest here. Hands up if you were the one delivering that boring or irrelevant presentation at the time. I love a few of you honest. My commitment to you is the next 20 or so minutes will be neither of those two things, boring or irrelevant. I want to make sure it's going to be very practical. It's going to speak directly to so many of the themes we've been hearing about so far this morning. It's going to be a very honest conversation, and I just want to make sure it's a bit of fun as well, because fun is often underrated at conferences when Julie is not the MC. You are superb as an MC. You're doing a phenomenal job. So let's just keep this fun theme going. I want to start our time together as we think about the future by going back. I want to take you all back this morning to high school science class, to somewhere around year 10 or year 11, depending on where you went to high school. And I want to ask you a question relating to something you learnt in science class. And this is a little game we're going to play called Were You Paying Attention? Okay? So here, up on the screen, is the question I want to ask you this morning. Okay, which law of physics states that matter left to itself will always tend toward decay and disintegration? Now, how many of you looking at that question already know you were not paying attention? You've got no idea what the answer to this question is. Hands up is in that category. I love the honesty. All right, 4 options, multiple choice. Okay, is it A, the law of atrophy? Is it B, the law of dystrophy? Is it C, the law of entropy? Or is it D, the law of dysentery? Okay, those are your 4 options. I'm going to give you like a 10-second countdown, and then we're going to do a straw poll. So feel free to turn to the person next to you, compare notes, compare memories, and we'll come back and do a bit of a straw poll. And there is your countdown, 10 seconds. Some people trying to access old memories here this morning. All right, there's your buzzer. Show of hands. Who here thinks it might be A, the law of atrophy? Who's going to go with A this morning? Okay, a few very confident A's. Interesting. All right. Let's go with B, the law of dystrophy. Who's going to go for B? I love the lack of confidence. Like, I have no idea. I'll just give it a shot, whatever. Okay, who's going to go with C, the law of entropy? All right, and there's normally one in every crowd. Who's going to go for D, the law of dysentery here this morning? Who's going to fly the flag for D? There's a few of you. Okay, correct answer, interestingly, was the one that only just won then. I had the most common responses. The correct answer, interestingly, here is actually C, the law of entropy. And remember in school, our teachers would teach us stuff like this, and they would say, pay attention, because one day you'll need to know this stuff, right? And we were all 15 and thought as if we'll ever need to know this stuff, because you know so much when you're 15, don't you? And I remember thinking the same thing when I learnt this stuff in high school science. Little did I know, a number of years later, I would dedicate a chunk of my career to studying this law and how it applies to organisations, to industries, to businesses, and it goes to the very core theme we're going to talk about briefly here this morning. In fact, just to give you a bit of my backstory, I've spent 14 years now studying this whole theme of transforming, adapting in the face of change. What are some of the trends that are shaping society, shaping organisations, and how do we gear up for that change? But a very pivotal year for my research was 2011. If you cast your mind back to that year, the reason that was such a key year is because that's the year we saw a number of iconic organisations and brands fall prey to this law of entropy. I mean, big ones. In fact, in the space of 4 months, we saw 3 big ones collapse. We saw the demise of Borders Bookstore, Saab Automotive, filed for bankruptcy, but the big one, of course, was Kodak. And that was so significant. Even though we knew it was coming, it was significant because, I mean, they were the Apple, they were the Google of their day. And so in 2011, I embarked on a research project designed to look at this question of why. Why are so many organisations at the cutting edge losing that edge so quickly and becoming irrelevant? And so over the next 3.5 years, I travelled around the world and working with leaders and studying 500 organisations in the public sector, the private sector, in health, in the non-profit sector, to understand what are some of the things that are causing organisations to become irrelevant over time. And you think over the last few years, how many organisations and brands we've seen fall prey to that law of entropy. In fact, have a look at this little montage on the screen behind me. This is a bit of a selection of brands that, if they aren't bankrupt, they're on their way there, or they're a shadow of their former selves. So you think of the significance of some of these businesses up on the screen here. And by the way, some of these have only joined this list in the last few weeks. We saw Rockport Shoes file for bankruptcy just 2.5 weeks ago over in the US. A number of them stand out to me there. One that's particularly interesting is Atari. Now, I was at a conference a few years ago. The other keynote speaker at this event was Steve Wozniak, Apple's co-founder. And it was really interesting. I thought, I wonder if I'll get a chance to meet him. And if you know anything of Steve Wozniak's reputation, humble, down-to-earth, unassuming. I actually got a chance to spend about 20 minutes backstage with him in the green room talking about some of these brands. And he said from his perspective, the saddest one is Atari. Because he said, I wish you could see it. When Steve Jobs and I started Apple, our goal was to build a company modelled on Atari. At the time, they were shorthand for innovation. They had an incredible culture. And to see them go from that place of market leadership to being out of business 32 years later is just incredibly sad to have watched unfold. And so the research over that 3.5 years looked at two questions. First question was, why does this happen? And the second question was the question of, why do the enduring prevail? What do some organisations do that allows them to stay at the cutting edge in the face of massive, widespread change? And those questions and that research culminated in a book that came out a number of years ago called Winning the Battle for Relevance. I want to pick up on some of the themes of this book in the few minutes we've got together. Because while it's valuable to look back retrospectively at how change has unfolded and how it's taken out organisations and institutions, the far more interesting story is this. What's coming next? What are some of the trends that will shape the next 5 to 10 to 15 years that will cause institutions to falter, to lose their edge? And we're not just talking big businesses here. We're talking every sort of institution or organisation, yourselves included. And it's interesting, I was speaking with a colleague recently and he said something that stuck with me after our conversation. His name is Professor Gary Hamel, and he's a professor at the London Business School. And Gary Hamel said this, he said, you cannot outrun the future if you do not see it coming. And the biggest challenge for all of us, and certainly in health, is you guys get so focused on the urgent, the immediate, that to zoom out at times and actually think, what are the things that are coming in the next 5 to 10 years is actually really difficult to do. And that's why events like this are so valuable to, I guess, get that sense of the things that are on the horizon. And we could talk about a whole range of different trends that will shape the next few years, but one of the biggest ones we're going to see is the influence of artificial intelligence, the rise of the robots, and we'll look at the impact of this in the health space in a few moments. But you think of how sort of artificial intelligence is going to transform life as we know it in so many ways. I mean, for instance, what happens when computers begin driving our cars? I mean, who finds the whole notion of driverless cars just the tiniest bit nerve-wracking? Hands up if you do. I think a lot of us probably do. The reality is these are nowhere near as far off as most of us think. In fact, I'm speaking with some of the smartest minds in the industry on a regular basis. Their expectation is these will be on our roads by 2027, somewhat mainstream. Now, I want to show you in a few moments up here on the screen behind me a test being done by Waymo, which is Google's driverless car outfit, right now in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, this is a driverless car test that doesn't hit pedestrians, okay? That was Uber, okay? This is Waymo. And as I show you this experiment here, and these are the tests going on right now, put yourself in the back seat of this vehicle. What would it be like to be in a car with no one at the helm of that vehicle? And while this is interesting in terms of, as a consumer, what this would feel like, you think about how many industries this is going to massively disrupt in the next few years. For instance, the automotive insurance industry. Now, I work with insurers, they're my clients. I want to tell you, they are getting pretty nervous right now about this stuff here. Like, we're talking sphincter tightening nervousness, okay? Because you have to think about it. If you have an accident in a driverless vehicle, who's at fault? Who makes the claim on their insurance? The entire basis of that industry becomes something of a moot point the moment the person at the helm of the car is no longer in control of that vehicle. When you think about another massive industry that will be disrupted by driverless cars, and it'll be the paid parking industry. I mean, how many of you paid to park your car somewhere in the last week? Parking stations, parking meters, who's done this in the last week? Most of us probably have. Keep your hands up if you enjoyed the experience. Look, none of us. Now, the moment we have to do this, we haven't got a choice. But within 15 years, there's every likelihood no one in this room will ever pay to park your car anywhere, ever again. How cool would that be, firstly, okay? But here's why. Once you have a driverless vehicle, your driverless car will say, drop you at work in the morning. You'll wander in through the doors of the hospital, go to the wards, get to work. Your driverless car may well go home and wait for you till you're finished and come back and pick you up, Batmobile style, okay? Or what if, this is probably the more likely scenario, what if your driverless car drops you at work, and while you're at work throughout the day, your driverless vehicle goes into a pool of other driverless cars, Uber style, earning you cash, ferrying other people around throughout the day while you're at work? Or, hey, you take it a step further than that, and this is really likely. In 15 years' time, if there are thousands of Uber-style driverless vehicles you can hail on your phone at the drop of a hat, why would you bother even owning a car in the first place? Now, this is the existential threat facing the auto industry right now. I actually read a prediction recently that within 30 years, owning a car will be like owning a horse today. I think that's interesting as a notion. I mean, you'll do it if it's a hobby or a passion, but not as your primary mode of getting from point A to point B. I mean, so that's just one area of society that is being massively disrupted by some of these forward-facing trends. And we could talk about, I mean, the revelation last week about Uber Air. I don't know if you caught a thing I did on the Today Show on Saturday about Uber Air and how this is all going to unfold. Who saw this news breaking last week? I mean, it's extraordinary. These are the drones that Uber are looking to trial in Sydney by the year 2020. They want to have them operational by 2023. A 30 or 40-minute trip, let's say from North Sydney to the airport, will take you 2 or 3 minutes. And it'll cost the same as Uber Black, which is the premium version. This is going to transform the whole notion of transportation. But if you think about the health space, in health specifically, what is the impact of AI? And some of the technologies we're talking about, the rise of the robots. And, you know, I'm reading a lot of stuff about how technology will replace health professionals, and I quite simply don't buy it. I don't buy it. And one of the reasons is, and I love, like, my favourite moment today was when you, Chris, when you stepped forward, like the cracking voice and the holding back tears. Why I loved that is because that goes to the core of what makes this all work. It's that. I mean, in Japan right now, with a rapidly aging population, they are racing to develop robots for aged care and healthcare generally, and they're doing a great job. And one of the points I make in a book that I released a few months ago about some of this technology is that you can automate caregiving, but you can't automate caring. You cannot get a machine to actually give a stuff because it doesn't. There's no soul. And that's what I love about what you guys do. I mean, some of the technology we'll talk about in a few moments will augment what you do, but it will never replace what you do in a really important way. But if you think about some of the impact of artificial intelligence and robotics already in the health sector, it's a fascinating time to be alive and be operating in health. I mean, look, for instance, at the impact of the Da Vinci robot, and we've got one out there today. I think that the Device Technologies mob have got one out there at the moment. I've done some work with Device Technologies in the last 12 months, and it's extraordinary how impactful this technology is. I mean, right now, 40% of all robots being shipped worldwide, 40%, are for surgical purposes. That is massive. Most of us think of robots and we think of car assembly lines and dispatchers and warehousing. 40% is going into the surgical arena. I was talking to some of the guys from Device, and they're telling me that 80% of prostate surgeries today are done using robotic intervention. So you think about the impact of this at a large scale, at a slightly smaller scale, and this ties in beautifully to what we heard from the team at the Burns unit this morning. I was reading 3.5 weeks ago, I don't know if you saw this news when it broke, that the University of Toronto have just released the prototype for a handheld 3D printer for skin grafts using a patient's stem cells, so the potential for a rejection is almost entirely nullified. And this is only 3.5, 4 weeks old. It's not operational yet, but it gives you a sense of where we're going. And some of the bioprinting you've already heard about that'll be showcased later on. It's an exciting time to see some of this technology come into the fore. But what gets really interesting is at the tiniest scale possible. In the world of nanotechnology, that is the new frontier for health. In fact, I was reading some interesting stuff just a few weeks ago about a trial being done right now between Arizona State University. They're partnering up with the Chinese National Center of Nanoscience and Technology, and they're producing these microscopic smart bots, nanobots, that have a payload of thrombin, an enzyme for blood clotting that goes directly to identify as a tumor and injects that tumour with thrombin, cuts off the tumour's blood supply, and the tumour begins shrinking within 2 days. These things are 1/100th the size of a millimetre. They are tiny, and this is the sense of where we are going. And I mean, as you can probably gather, we could spend stacks of time talking about just the other stuff coming, and I'm mindful of the time we've got together. If it'd be useful, because I want to move on in a few moments and go to this theme of Imagine, Transform, Lead, how do we get ready for this stuff? But if it'd be useful, one thing we did recently was we put a report together looking at the top 20. We've touched on a couple of them there. What are the key macro trends that are going to be game changes in the next few years? In the few minutes we've got left, I want to look at this whole question of bearing in mind what's changing as a sector and as a professional. How do you gear up for it? What's required here? You know, we looked at a collection of brands before that have had a challenging few years. This is a very different collection of brands. These brands, what they all have in common is they have lasted the distance. They've been around for not just years or decades, but centuries. And the question is, what have they done? What's the culture they've built that's allowed them to stay at the cutting edge in the face of massive disruption and change over a long period of time? And I want to put it to you, there are 3 things that every organisation, every institution must do if you're going to navigate change well. So if you've got something to write some notes down with, maybe grab it out because we'll move pretty quickly here. First key is this. If you're going to stay at the forefront in a time of change, you need to dig the well before you get thirsty. In other words, you need to reinvent yourself, transform yourself, before change forces you to do so. Now, we talk about the theme of leading change. Leading is so important because it takes a gutsy leader to change when your hand is not being forced yet. Because when things are working okay, the temptation is to go, hey, it's fine. Don't break it if it's not broken. And yet that is the very mentality necessary if you're going to stay at the cutting edge. I was doing some work with Toyota last year, and one of the core basic mentalities in Toyota came from one of their previous global chairmen, a guy named Hiroshi Okuda, who was famous for saying this: reform business when business is good. Now, of course, we're not in business here, but the same principle applies. The time to reinvent yourself, to adapt to change, is when things are already working, when things are going great guns. That's the time to start tinkering and shifting and transforming, not to wait until your hand is forced. And there are plenty of examples of organisations that have done this beautifully over the years. One of my favourites is the example of the company connected to this product here. Who knows the name of this brand connected with this product? Hands up. Corning, lots of you do. Now, Corning, this year, are 178 years old. What's interesting about Corning, what you may not know, is at the beginning of last century, early 1900s, most of their revenue came from making light globes. They were the leaders in doing that. The challenge was, even though their business was good, making a stack of money, they realised with more competitors coming in, things were changing. They couldn't stay there. Profit margins would be squeezed. They were going to lose market share. And that's when they reinvented themselves before they were forced to do so, to go into markets like the cook and kitchenware market. Now, most of us still think of Corning today as this stuff here in your kitchens. What you may not know is most of their revenue today comes from products entirely removed from this world. In fact, many of them are from the medical device space. In fact, this is a diagnostics board being used in surgical wards right now around the world, made using Corning glass. I was working with Medtronic last year. They were telling me one of their products is these capsules you can swallow that go throughout your system, taking the video footage of what's happening in your body. And they were telling me, I don't know how you get the footage off these things. I guess they come out, you hose them off and download the footage somehow. They were telling me the tiny lenses in these capsules are made using Corning glass. The same formula for making glass they've used for over 150 years at the cutting edge of medical devices. Now, I'm guessing many of you have probably heard this quote on the screen. It's almost a cliche these days that Einstein said in his Sanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get a different result. Who's heard that before? Probably most of us have. It is a cliche almost these days. Can I suggest, though, if Einstein were defining insanity in 2018, bearing in mind the pace of change we're experiencing right now, I reckon he'd say that actually today insanity is the opposite of that. Today insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get the same result. And what I mean by that is if you're using the same techniques, the same approaches, the same mentality you were using 2 or 3 years ago, expecting it to be as effective today as it was 2 or 3 years ago, you are going to be sorely mistaken. The pace of change necessitates that we need to constantly be updating, even though it's uncomfortable and confronting. I love this quote from the former head of GE, Jack Welch said this. He said, "The moment the rate of change outside an organisation exceeds the rate of change within it, the end is near." How true is that? And this is our challenge. How do we stay half a step ahead of the stuff happening around us as a sector? So that's the first key. Dig the well before you get thirsty. And it goes to the core of this theme of leadership. If you're going to lead change, changing before you're forced is a difficult thing to do, but necessary. Number two, second key is this. You need to think revolution, not evolution. Most of us think of innovation as an evolutionary process, continual improvement, and that has a place, obviously has a place. But can I suggest, in the age we are all operating in, evolutionary change ain't gonna cut it. It's just not gonna be enough. I love this insight from the former head of the business faculty at San Francisco University. Oren Harari said this. He said, "Remember, the electric light never came from the continuous improvement of candles." Isn't that great? I love that because it's so true. It didn't matter how good you got at making candles, how long they lasted, how pure the light was, there came a point where a fundamental rethink of how you made light was required. And that's the point we're at right now. Now, can I suggest, though, if you're going to be revolutionary, this requires an appetite for audacity, boldness, risk-taking. Now, of course, in the medical world, it's got to be sensible, measured risk-taking because it can be life or death in most instances. But taking risks, not always colouring inside the lines, trying stuff that is daring and audacious. One of my favourite examples of a business that's done this over the years is Dyson. Now, I've worked with Dyson recently and I'm so impressed with the culture they have as a business. They're constantly taking risks. I mean, the very risks involved in creating this vacuum cleaner are extraordinary, and how much failure they are willing to go through. It took 5,127 prototypes and it took 15 years to come up with this revolution. It took a lot of willingness to persist through failure. And what's interesting, by the way, when we think about culture, one of the challenges for Dyson in recent years is they'd grown so much, they were losing this culture of audacity. And one thing they did a few years ago to try and reinstate it was a thing called the Dyson Spirit Awards. Now here's how it works. To get a Dyson Spirit Award, and maybe they get big checks as well, who knows, right? But Dyson Spirit Award requires you to have failed in the previous 12 months. Now just let that sink in for a moment. And what I loved about this is one of the women who won this award a few years ago, when they released the stick vacuum cleaners, the cordless vacuum cleaners, she had this idea. What if, and this is for the Australian launch, what if we put these in all the service departments around Australia so people could try them while they were on holidays and go, these are awesome, I'll have to buy one. So they spent a lot of money putting these stick vacuum cleaners in every service department. The problem was, 6 months in, they realised that none of them had been used because who vacuums when they're on holidays? I mean, if you spill something, it's like, well, someone else will clean it up, okay? And so she won the Dyson Spirit Award that year. Well-intentioned, sensible risk-taking, being innovative, something that didn't work, they learned from it, but that's a powerful thing to set culture. Because so often in organisations, our culture is if you make a mistake, you are shunned, you're on the outer. We all step back and point and say, oh, I wouldn't have done that. I could have told you that wouldn't work. In those moments, that sets culture. I love this quote from Frank Wilczek, a Nobel Prize winner in 2004. He said, if you are not making mistakes, you are not working on hard enough problems. If you look back at the last 12 months and you're in a position where everything has been fine, no big stuff-ups, that needs to be a red flag. You're probably not innovating enough to stay one step ahead. All right, let's keep going. Number 3, third and final key is this. You need to embrace fresh eyes. This is the beauty of an event like this, is that you get people who are outside your context who will look at what you do with a fresh perspective because it's not their daily experience. I love the insight from the late Dr. Wayne Dyer. He said this, when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. And that's the beauty of with people with a fresh perspective, someone who's outside your normal context, is they will see stuff that you will miss because you get so close to what you see on a daily basis. Now, people with fresh eyes particularly, by the way, if they're new to the sector, brand new to the sector, that's a great source of fresh eyes, have no trouble thinking outside the box. I love this student's exam response as a case in point of thinking outside the box in a way that no one really expected. Now, school teachers will tell you this is not called fresh eyes, okay? It's called smart ass, okay? But it does make the point. But this is the beauty of fresh eyes. Often the best innovations come from those who are novices, who are new, who don't know better yet. And there's some great examples of this. And one of the best examples I come across is this guy here. Masood Hassani is a young guy in his early 20s, grew up in Kabul, Afghanistan, in a country that is littered with landmines. One of the biggest challenges for Afghanistan is the number of landmines that they've got to deal with. And this guy, not an expert in dealing with landmines or munitions, one day noticed a tumbleweed blowing across the fields. He thought, what if we created something that was like a tumbleweed to detonate landmines? So he created this thing here called the Mine Kafon, K-A-F-O-N. This is a plastic hub with bamboo spears that come out of it, costs very little to make, and these things can withstand about 8 or 9 explosions before they get destroyed. And once they release them, they just blow around the fields, detonating landmines. Now this idea didn't come from a military expert, it came from a 22-year-old. Now coming to a medical environment, look at the power of fresh eyes. I love this guy here who won an award for innovation about 2 years back. Julian Rios Cantu. We'd call him Julian, but Julian, I'm sure, is how he would like to be pronounced. This guy is extraordinary. His mum had breast cancer. He watched her whole ordeal and experience. This is a guy without any medical training, but watched all this happen. And he's from Mexico, a country where there are 9.5 mammography machines for every 1 million people. Access to services is incredibly low. And with the benefit of fresh eyes not knowing any better, look what he invented. He invented a smart bra that syncs with an app on your iPhone with 200 sensors that measures changes in shape, temperature, colour, texture of the breast. He wear it for 1 hour a week, and it is so extraordinarily effective at identifying breast cancers in the early stage. And it didn't come from a medical expert, it came from an 18-year-old who just didn't know any better. And that's the benefit of being in this environment where you get different perspectives and fresh eyes. That's where innovations so often come from. All right, we are pretty much out of time. I'm very mindful of the clock because we're running late. What I will do, though, before we finish up, because I'm mindful of how quickly we've gone, feel free to check out the website. So we put a lot of stuff up there that will be useful for you. A whole lot of video clips. We've got a whole video library on our website with short clips that build on some of the things that we've talked about this morning. So feel free to check that out if that will be of value. We also threw a couple of books in case they'd be helpful, and as Julie said, happy to sign these if they would be of any use. I think that we're going to be out near the sports car out here at morning tea. So some copies of this is the new one that came out a couple of months back, looking at lots of the research we've talked about this morning. What are the trends coming? How do you gear up for it? And there's also some copies of that book on how organisations stay at the cutting edge. What's the culture required to do that? So feel free to check those out. But as we draw all this to a close, I wanted to leave you this morning with a quote, and this is one of my favourite quotes right now. What I love about this quote is it's 2,600 years old, and yet I reckon it's more relevant today than ever before. And it's a quote from the great Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who said this. He said, "Resisting change is a little bit like trying to hold your breath. Even if you are successful, okay? It's not going to end well." And that's an encouragement for all of us. I mean, the reality is stuff is changing. There's massive disruption and change in the sector. We can't fight it. We can't ignore it. The only thing we can do is adapt. So thank you again for the invite. I hope that was useful. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.